So what you should see now is a white screen with tutorial in the middle, the cardiovascular system. Please let me know via chat if you can't see that. Yeah, hopefully you can see that. Great. Okay. So the aim of this tutorial now on the cardiovascular system is there are four aims really. Firstly, with regards to anatomical terminology, which we'll be talking about, is to help you to recognize the need to use precise anatomical terms. So this first part is related to the very first lecture you had in the principles of cardiac sonography. And then secondly, with regards to the cardiovascular system, to help you to discern the primary function of essential parts of the cardiovascular system. That means to really appreciate what the main role of different elements of the cardiovascular system have, and secondly, differentiate between these components. So compare and contrast may be another way of describing that. And then thirdly, we'll talk about the cardiac cycle and recognize the separate phases within the cardiac cycle. So Kenny went into ECGs in detail from a different point of view. What we're going to look at it is perhaps from the standpoint of echocardiography. So anatomical terminology. This is a famous artwork from a famous artist and physiologist and philosopher, Leonardo da Vinci, and he lived in the 16th century. The reason I put that up is he was an anatomist, among other things, and he was one of the people who was, even at that stage, using language that helped to describe anatomy clearly. This isn't something that's just, new to us. This is something that's very much part of the history of the study of anatomy. It's really important to understand these terms. This is not difficult, and for you, most of you, this will be revision. So some of the terms you'll need to be familiar with include superior, inferior, anterior, posterior. So just have a think for a moment. What does superior mean? Inferior? What does anterior, what does posterior mean? What does medial and lateral mean? What does proximal and distal mean? Here, the meaning of the first terms there. Superior means nearer to the head. Inferior, nearer to the feet. Anterior, nearer to the front. Posterior, nearer to the back. Once you understand these terms, this can be applied not only to the body as a whole, but to systems and to organs, and obviously to the heart. And then medial means nearer to the median plane. Lateral, farther from the median plane. Proximal, nearer to the point of origin. Distal, farther from the point of origin. And this slide here just provides some images. We sonographers tend to like images, and it helps just to reinforce some of the things I went through. These slides, this presentation will all be available, so you can go through them in order to review them and to review the different terminologies we're discussing. And of course, they were covered in lecture 1 as well. A couple of other things that's important to appreciate, and they're not so much terms that relate to specific anatomical structures, but are more reference points. And oftentimes you'll hear reference to the apex or to the base. Well, the apex is a very specific point, and the apex is formed by the left ventricle. That is at least in a normal heart. Whereas the base really tends to refer to the more superior portion of the heart, nothing specific, but more related to superior portion of the atria when you look at the heart as a whole. Nonetheless, when you break things down, you might talk about the basal segments in the left ventricle. So they're the segments more superior. Remembering that the image at the bottom of this screen here is inverted. So the left ventricle, which is inferior to the left atrium, is actually at the top of the screen, and that's standard for echocardiography. Another thing that's valuable to remember is that the valves, generally speaking, lie along a horizontal plane about a third of the way down from the superior margin of the heart. They're not in one exact horizontal line, but very similar. And moreover, they're supported by a fibrous skeleton, and that skeleton supports the annulus of each of the valves. So that's another important thing to remember. One of the reasons it is important to remember is that any deviation from that is may well be indicative of serious disease. So, for example, and this is just an example, we'll cover this in greater depth when we come to congenital heart disease, but if, for example, there is a significant offset between the mitral and tricuspid valve leaflets seen in an echocardiogram using the view that we're looking at there, it may well indicate that there's a disease process called Ebstein's anomaly. Again, you're not meant to know that, but what's characteristic of that is the displacement of the tricuspid valve, apical displacement of the tricuspid valve. So they're trying to display one of the reasons it's important both to know the valve plane and also be able to know how to phrase things, because as soon as you start using those terms, people with an understanding of disease appreciate what you're talking about. There are imaging planes that you'll need to become very familiar with, and what I want to do early on is just help you to appreciate that what I'm not talking about here is imaging windows. I'm talking about imaging planes. So an imaging window is the window through a rib space that you direct the ultrasound beam via the probe in order to achieve a particular view, whereas I'm talking about planes here. I'm talking about the way that you slice through the heart with your 2D ultrasound beam. So there are 4 standard echocardiographic imaging planes: the long axis plane and short axis plane, the 4-chamber plane and the 2-chamber plane. And I'll go into each of those in a little bit more detail here. Let me just check the chat. I hope everyone's following along. Everything's going okay so far. using the chat function, please, if you would like me to pause and elaborate, let me know. Okay, I'll keep going for the moment. So the long axis plane, well, the long axis means a line parallel to the length of an object. But when we're imaging and when we're talking about the heart, usually the point of reference is the left ventricle. For a number of reasons, the left ventricle is important, and when imaging with echocardiography, it's oftentimes the point of reference. And so when we're talking about the long axis plane, we're usually talking about a plane that cuts the left ventricle in a certain way. That is to say that it displays the length of the left ventricle. The short axis plane is simply a plane that's perpendicular to that. So that is to say that a plane that's at right angles to the long axis plane. So with both the illustration and the echo images down the bottom there, I hope you can appreciate that the long axis and the short axis are 90 degrees to one another. Let me just play this for a moment. No, it's not gonna play. Okay, I'll keep going. Two other important planes to be aware of are the 4-chamber plane and the 2-chamber plane. The 4-chamber plane is a plane that cuts the heart from base to apex, or apex to base, whichever way you want to look at it. And it reveals all 4 chambers. And with a true 4-chamber view, you should also see the 2 atrioventricular valves, both their medial and lateral aspects. So the AV valves, of course, the atrioventricular valves, they are the mitral and tricuspid valves. You should see those both clearly in the 4-chamber plane. And then the 2-chamber plane is at 90 degrees to this. And in the 2-chamber plane, as the name suggests, you see just 2 chambers. In this particular case, we're looking the 2-chamber view, the left ventricle, which shows the left atrium, the left ventricle, and of course, you can see some other structures too, including the mitral valve. So those 4 planes, I encourage you to remember, get used to. The long axis view of the left ventricle can be viewed from an apical plane. The 4-chamber view of the heart can be viewed from the subcostal view. A short axis view of the heart can be viewed from the subcostal view. So these aren't things that are only limited to the views that I show you there. It's helpful to understand those planes, those terms. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about the cardiovascular system. So I'll start by just reminding you what the primary function of the cardiovascular system is, and in short, it's to provide a transport system for the body, because the body needs nutrients and needs to be able to get rid of waste products. So the cardiovascular system has been beautifully designed to make that possible. It provides a transport system so that, essential elements, essential minerals, essential vitamins, oxygen, water, etc., can be delivered to the organs, to the tissues, to the cells, and then to transport things away from those cells, away from those organs, waste products like carbon dioxide and urea. A question though, just time for you to wake up. What are the three principal components of the cardiovascular system? Not meant to shock you. Don't think too hard. I'm sure you know it. We've been talking a lot about the heart. Well, it's the heart, blood vessels, and blood itself. We'll go into more detail about the heart, and we'll talk about cardiac anatomy in a moment. So let me just concentrate on the other two, blood vessels and blood itself. So if you were to name the three types of blood vessels, I'm sure you would have come up with this answer. There are arteries, capillaries, and veins. There are also arterioles, which are part of the systemic circulation, part of the arterial circulation, and there are venules, which are part of the venous circulation. Generally speaking, there are three types: arteries, capillaries, and veins. How might we distinguish between these? How are they different? Well, I'll give you just a moment to think about that. In short, you might want to come up with three different ways of trying to distinguish between them. Well, three ways. The direction of blood flow within these vessels helps to distinguish them. Certainly distinguishes between arteries and veins. That is to say, arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins return blood to the heart. Capillaries are the point of exchange, so blood flow within capillaries is very slow to enable the movement of the exchange of the various things that are being taken up and offloaded by the cells. And then the wall thickness too. Typically arteries have walls significantly thicker than veins, and the muscular layer, the middle muscular layer in particular of the arteries is thicker, and has good reason too. It's actually it's not something static, it's dynamic. And according to the body's needs, those muscles can actually, contract and help to change the blood pressure. And the lumen obviously is related to that as well. That's the third distinguishing factor. The lumen is the space filled by the blood itself, the central portion of the vessel through which the blood travels. So they're the sort of the three distinguishing features. And then we've got blood as well. Another question: what are the three primary functions of blood? Very much in keeping with the main function of the cardiovascular system, blood serves to transport various things. It helps to regulate, among other things, the temperature, and helps to protect, for example, via a clotting mechanism. I won't go into the clotting mechanism in detail. These are three essential functions of blood. And then within blood, there are different elements. Okay, and I'll get you to think for a moment, what are they? And what is their function? Okay, and for a lot of you, this is fairly straightforward revision, but In short, there are three formed elements within the blood: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And we could go into a lot of detail about this. I mean, hematology is a whole area of study itself, but it's important nonetheless to know the primary functions of these particular elements. So red blood cells obviously transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. White blood cells are an integral part of the immune function of the body. And platelets, their main role is in clotting. And just a little bit more about the cardiac cycle itself. This is the third part of the tutorial. I might pause there for just a moment. Are there any questions? Again, feel free to chat away. Ask me any questions. Ask me to reinforce something or go over it. Okay. So I want to look at this from a slightly different angle to what Kenny was. Kenny was looking at things simply the electrical conduction, but what I wanted to do is ask you a couple of questions. What does systole mean? What does diastole mean? Do atria and ventricles contract simultaneously? Do both ventricles contract simultaneously? Just to help you to put some of the theory in perspective. Well, systole I think it's a Greek word that just means contract. So when we're talking about systole, we're talking about a contractile phase. Diastole means, again, it's a Greek word that means relax. So we're talking about the relaxation phase. Do the atria and ventricles contract simultaneously? No. The atria contract before the ventricles. It seems obvious, but it's so important for the proper function of the heart. Kenny was talking a little bit earlier about some arrhythmias, and when there's dysynchrony between the atria and the ventricles, when the P waves are not occurring regularly before the ventricles, that causes problems. So normally the atria and ventricles contract synchronously, but not simultaneously. Do both ventricles contract simultaneously? Yes, they do. So perhaps what I'll do is I'll just highlight something here, if I can, using this spotlight function. So remember here, P wave indicates atrial systole. So there is an atrial systolic phase. Most of the time, during a cardiac cycle, the atria are in their diastolic phase. The ventricular systole, which is initiated by the movement of ions and electrical signal on the ECG shown by the QRS complex, occurs just after that. The mechanical motion of the heart occurs just after that, and again, a little bit like the atria, majority of the cardiac cycle, the ventricles are relaxing. What I want to help you to appreciate there is the atria and ventricles obviously aren't contracting at the same time, but both atria are contracting at the same time, the left and right atrium. Both ventricles, the left and right ventricles, contracting at the same time. Just try something here. Most often, and when we're imaging, the cardiac cycle is somewhat abbreviated, or rather than starting when we're imaging with the P wave, it's easier for the machine to capture images starting with a QRS complex and ending with a QRS complex. So when we're talking about a cardiac cycle, when we're imaging in echocardiography, we're recording the motion of the heart from one ventricular contraction to the next. I think that's just an important thing just to once you get used to it, it makes complete sense and you don't think otherwise. So what we see is sometimes if you say, take one cardiac cycle or two cardiac cycles, the machine, the default will be to capture an image from a QRS complex until the next one. Something to bear in mind. This slide looks a little bit daunting, but I'd just like to highlight a couple of things here. Again, we've been talking about ECGs. See the P wave, QRS complex, T wave. What I'll have you notice is that obviously the myocardial contraction, the mechanical action, occurs after the P wave. So the electrical activity occurs just slightly before the mechanical activity. That's an important thing to keep in mind, especially when you're making measurements, and we'll be able to apply that a little bit better when we're better able to do some more practical things. And the same with the ventricles. There's the QRS complex, and you can see here ventricular contraction happens afterwards. Ventricular contraction results in significant changes in pressure within the ventricles. You can see here in diastole, the ventricles, or the pressure within the left ventricle is relatively low, and then with systole, the contraction of the ventricle, there's a rapid rise in pressure. That rise in pressure is the reason that heart valves open and close. So an important thing to appreciate is that heart valves are moving in response to changes in pressure. There's not a mechanical activation of the heart valves. They are one-way valves that move in response to changes in pressure within chambers. So they're the three things I want to highlight there. I think there might be a question, so let me just go up here for a moment. No question. I'm just letting someone in. I might pause for a moment. Are there any questions? No. Okay. And lastly, just I want to make things clear with regards to the cardiac cycle, that there's certain things to appreciate about the normal motion of the heart. And one of them is something that I was just talking about now, which is synchrony. And if you look carefully at the image and direct your eyes firstly to the atria, you mainly appreciate their filling. You can see them, the left atrium in particular, get bigger just prior to the mitral valve opening. You can certainly, if you direct your eyes to the left ventricle, appreciate its motion, contractile motion in particular. And then what I'll get you to do is look at both of them and notice that as one fills with blood, the other is in a different phase. So the atrial filling coincides with ventricular contraction. So the atrial diastole coincides with ventricular systole. And what you'll also notice there too is that with normal function, the mitral valve, and you see the tricuspid valve a little bit there, is that the valve is very mobile, and that's a normal appearance, very typical. If the motion of valves is somewhat impaired, that's typically indicative of disease. So with the normal function of the heart, you notice synchronous activity. You notice that the valves are opening, that the valve should be closing as well. I guess you can't fully appreciate that there with that image. So we have a look at blood flow. What we can see in this particular image here is we see a lot of red and then a lot of blue. We don't happen to see in this particular image any blood flow that's going backwards, and so that's an indication that the heart valves are working normally. And of course, for normal heart function, the motion, especially the ventricles, needs to be forceful. So you want, if we look at the top image again, to see the ventricles both moving inwards and thickening. There's sort of two aspects of the heart's motion that you see there. But there should also be adequate ventricular relaxation, and you can't fully appreciate that just with this image. But you can certainly see that the ventricle is moving. It gives an impression that that's happening. So let me just go back to reinforce some things to you. I want you just to appreciate in this tutorial that we need to use precise terms to help us clearly indicate matters about anatomy. That the primary the primary function of the cardiovascular system and primary functions of different elements are important to recognize, and it's important to differentiate between them. And also that within the cardiac cycle there are different phases, and those phases represent important aspects that all come together to when normally enable the heart to function optimally, to provide the driving force of the circulation, and to allow us to move around and and do all that we need.